climate change policy is becoming a bigger and bigger issue in Canada. And one of the things that we need in order to, I guess, to monitor our climate policy and our outcomes is a climate accountability framework. And that was the topic of a report from the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices that came out last week. And we're going to be talking today to Anna Kanduth, who was one of the authors of the study. So welcome to the interview, Anna.
Thanks so much, Markham.
Now, maybe let's start this off with an overview of your report, and maybe you can tell us exactly what a climate accountability framework is.
Sure. So the report looks at, as you say, the concept of climate accountability frameworks and how they can help governments connect short-term policy actions with their long-term climate objectives. So in our report, we examine a number of international and domestic examples where climate accountability frameworks have been implemented to identify a series of common elements and best practices and make recommendations for how those climate accountability frameworks could be implemented in the Canadian context. But what is a climate accountability framework? Well, it's a set of governance structures and processes that, as I said, connect those long-term targets to near-term policy planning and implementation. And some of the common elements that we identified through our review is that they typically break up long-term greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets into interim milestones, often carbon budgets. They establish clear governance structures and processes to link milestones to policy actions. And they're most often supported by an independent expert advisory body. And they hold governments to account through regular and transparent monitoring and reporting on progress and course correction if they need to adjust policies to reach the milestones.
Now, one question I have for you, and we'll get into the framework, into the weeds here in a moment. But while I was listening to your explanation, it occurred to me that I couldn't give you an exhaustive list of Canadian climate policies. I couldn't tell you what the milestones are for Canada or for the provinces. And it seems, is that one of the benefits of taking this approach, is once you put a framework around it, then you can go, oh, those are the policies, those are the milestones, this is what we need to achieve, here are, how we're going to do that. Is that a benefit from a public relations point of view?
Absolutely. And two of the main benefits of a climate accountability framework are the accountability on the part of governments, but also transparency. So right now we don't have interim emissions reduction milestones at the national level. Two provinces, BC and Manitoba, have implemented climate accountability frameworks, including some interim emissions reduction milestones. But yeah, at the national level, we don't have them. So by implementing those, supported by this expert advice from an advisory body and kind of annual reporting and tracking, that will kind of bring those interim emissions reduction milestones and our progress towards them into the public sphere so that Canadians and other levels of government can hold the federal government or other orders who have implemented them to account for the targets they've set.
Here's a practical question for you. So BC has brought out this fairly assertive climate strategy called Clean BC. I think they announced it in 2018. And I was talking to one of the clean energy associations the other day, and they said, this is great. I mean, they want to reduce the provincial emissions from 64 megatons a year now to 14 megatons in 2050. I mean, it's very close to being, carbon neutral or net zero. And a lot of that has to do with electrification of the economy, but how will they do that? That's the big missing piece in that plan. Would your accountability framework hold the government to account for being more prescriptive or more descriptive on how they're going to achieve those goals?
Yeah, absolutely. So the frameworks themselves, and this is something that we've learned from looking at international experiences, legislating the framework in a law won't establish what the policies have to be for governments to implement. So that leaves the government of the day some flexibility in terms of what policies they'll implement to reach their targets, whether it is mass electrification or something else. But they will have to release annual plans that show how they're reaching those targets. So if they've committed to, say, a set carbon budget for 2025 and they've committed to mass electrification, and those annual reports from the expert advisory body are showing that they're not on track and they're not implementing those policies as planned, the government will have to explain, why they're not on track.
So this is an opportunity for us to be a little more rational and organized and structured in our approach to this, instead of kind of the willy-nilly, I think we're a little disorganized is my take on how, Canada's been approaching its climate policy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, organized or not, it's understandable that governments have a difficult time kind of conceptualizing a 2050 target. It is 30 years in advance. So having those 5-year interim emissions reduction milestones bring that 2050 target into perspective and kind of make it easier for governments to plan and make sure that their short-term actions are connecting to their long-term climate objectives.
Let me give you another practical example of this. I've written extensively and reported extensively about the Canadian oil sands. And, there was a big dust up with Norway here a couple of weeks ago. And one of the points that the Norwegians made was that there is no plan within the oil sands, no commitment to be net zero by 2050. They're aspirational goals. Would this kind of framework make it more incumbent upon companies like oil sands producers to actually make commitments and then demonstrate how they're going to follow through and meet those goals?
Yeah, one of the things that we explored looking at international experience and even domestically, because BC has done this, is the setting of sectoral level targets. But it's something that we don't recommend in the report. We recommend that these interim milestones be set only at the national level, and that you can kind of set sectoral or subnational budgets as information only to guide policy discussion. So there will be publicly available information about, what the oil sands may have to do to reach that national carbon budget or to get to net zero by 2050, but the federal government's not going to bind them to a set target within a 5 or 10-year period.
Now, you mentioned the phrase carbon budget, and I know in Alberta that's a contentious issue, primarily because Alberta is the biggest per capita emitter in Canada, 26% of national emissions. The oil sands alone is 11% of national emissions. And so the question becomes, how do you divvy up a carbon budget? Do you do it by population, in which case Alberta is, disadvantaged? Do you do it by percentage of GDP, in which case Alberta is, it's not quite as bad? What's your take on that?
Yeah, again, that's something that we explored at length in our analysis for this report. And we talk about the possibility of setting subnational budgets where, for example, Alberta would be given a legally binding milestone or budget that they would have to comply with. And it's something that we don't recommend because we don't think it's practical. The federal government can't actually force provinces or territories to act. And even if they did set those legally binding milestones on provinces or territories, it would actually be the federal government who would be accountable for them. So it could actually work to shift accountability away from the provinces towards a responsible minister in the federal government. And forcing these subnational budgets through legislation on provinces are going to get some backs up against the wall. And we really think that this type of accountability framework can be used as a forum to kind of hash out these really difficult discussions about effort sharing across the country. But if you have those conversations at the milestone setting stage, you may not get to the policy development stage.
Yeah, I think that's very, very interesting, apropos of the federal provincial powers, because we are in a fairly decentralized confederation. The federal government does not have absolute authority in many areas that have to do that over sectors that generate emissions, like oil and gas, for instance. So what, if I understand this correctly, what you're suggesting is the framework will help facilitate the difficult conversation that needs to be had between the federal government, the provincial government, and some of those big sectors. Have I read that correctly?
Yeah, exactly. And we acknowledge that, of course, to have effective action on climate change, you have to have all orders of government playing a role. So that means that the federal government's going to have to come to the table with its tools and policies, and so too are federal and provincial and territorial governments, Indigenous governments, and municipalities. And we recommend that everyone come to the table with their policies, but at the end of the day, if those policies and actions don't align with those interim emissions reduction targets and there's still a gap left by subnational policies, the federal government can step in and use its powers through a backstop mechanism to fill those gaps.
Right, and that's essentially what's happening, right? I mean, I know on the energy side, the federal government has backstop policies. And I've heard some discussion from oil and gas executives that better for Alberta to do it, and so they can tailor it to their requirements, than have it imposed by Ottawa. So it's a bit of a stick, but I think it sounds like maybe it's an effective stick.
Exactly, and I think sticks are there, but so are carrots. The federal government can use its financial incentives and spending powers, for example, through the Low Carbon Economy Fund, to encourage provinces to come to the table with their own policies. And as you were saying, provinces understand their regions and their sectors better than the federal government does, and are probably better suited to develop policies suited to their unique context. So the ideal is for them to come to the table with robust policies and that a federal backstop wouldn't have to be implemented.
Well, let's talk about some of those subnational policies, and in fact, municipal policies, because you recently wrote a blog post about green housing in Vancouver. Maybe you could give us an overview of that blog post, please.
For sure. So late last month, the City Council in Vancouver approved a set of amendments to the Vancouver Buildings bylaw, which aim to reduce carbon emissions from new single and multifamily homes. And the amendments kind of flew under the radar, and we thought at the Institute that it was something that deserved to be highlighted because it's a pretty big step. So some of the things that the amendment introduced was additional requirements for new residential buildings of 3 stories and under to be built with zero emission space and hot water heating. So heat pumps, whether air source or ground source, and electric baseboard heaters. They also lowered the cap on annual carbon emissions from large homes, so those above 3,500 square feet, from 3 to 2 tons per year. They also align some of the building requirements with both the BC Energy Step Code and with the National Energy Star program from the federal government. And they revised an existing requirement to ensure that new 1 and 2 family homes are outfitted with EV charging capacity.
I think you put your finger on a really not very sexy, not very visible, but nevertheless very important component of emissions reduction, and that is bylaws and regulations. So when we lived in a condo in White Rock, which had an underground parking, we were looking at buying an EV. There's no way to charge it. So we talked to the condo board, and they said, well, you know what, the cost of upgrading our electrical system to accommodate that, and it's just a nightmare, and it's very difficult. So did the city of Vancouver bring in, change the bylaw for new buildings, or does it also have provision for existing buildings like the one we were in White Rock?
Yeah, so these are all for new buildings, but that's a great point. And one of the things I did in my research was look at some cost comparisons from some other municipalities in BC, and one of them did a cost comparison of the cost to put in that EV charging capacity at time of construction versus retrofitting, as you're saying, and the cost difference is substantial. So it is really cost effective to do it at point of construction if we know that EVs are going to become more and more prominent in the future, in years to come.
Right. And one of the issues that I remember from a couple of years ago was Vancouver's banning, I guess, of natural gas for new homes. And that was quite controversial in Alberta, as you can imagine. We produce a lot of natural gas. Was that part of these new bylaw amendments?
Yeah, so new homes will have to be built with zero emission space and hot water heating, but they emphasize that they're not going to force people to retrofit their homes. So they're not going to tear away your natural gas stove. These are really just for new builds.
What's your take? And we haven't discussed this, so I'm not sure that you'll be able to answer the question, but I'll ask it anyway. We'll have a chat. We've had a couple of experts on talking about hydrogen. And one of the options would be to mix hydrogen in with natural gas to lower its emissions, and maybe eventually to replace natural gas with hydrogen and get rid of your emissions. That way you don't have to actually retrofit the building stock, the existing building stock. you can simply replace natural gas with a clean burning fuel. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I haven't had the opportunity to dig deep into the potential and opportunity for hydrogen, but I do know that the Institute is releasing a blog, I think in the next few weeks by my colleague, Jeremy, about just that. So stay tuned for that.
Excellent, thank you. Well, folks, all the questions that I have for Anna, so if you can raise your little blue hand, and then I'll call on you to unmute your mic and ask your question, please. So Dave Patterson, if you can unmute your mic, ask your question.
Hi, I'm wondering how these improved regulations about net zero in Vancouver fit in with the plans for the Canadian Building Code, how far ahead are they of the 2030 timetable for going net zero as a minimum standard?
Yeah, so they align with this. So Vancouver has the same goal of, excuse me, having zero emissions buildings or zero emissions in all new constructions by 2030. So this is in line with that objective, and it's also in line with the BC Energy Step Code, Step 4 of their code, which is also, I believe, striving for the same objective. But I'm not sure in terms of the specifics of the National Building Code.
Okay. Joe, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
So it wasn't that long ago that Canada had a Canadian Roundtable on Environment and the Economy, which was disbanded, I believe, by the Harper government. And I think we've all had some jealousy as to the UK's kind of oversight group that was governing the way the entire country managed its carbon emissions. And then just to throw in a third model, we know that in, I believe, the Netherlands, there was a court case that said that they were legally mandated to manage their emissions because of a civilian court decision that said that basically they had to safeguard us a climate for the future. So, looking at all of these different models, where do you see the best way of managing the entire country's emissions? And do you think there's hope that we can achieve your favorite model?
Yeah, for sure. So we joke that the UK Climate Change Act is kind of the thing that all policy wonks love to love. And it is one of the main case studies that we look at in our analysis of climate accountability frameworks, because it was the first country to legislate this kind of framework in 2008. And so a lot of the common elements and best practices that we identify in the report do actually draw from the UK experience. And they've seen a lot of success since the implementation of that act. It can't, necessarily be directly tied to the implementation of that act, but since 2008, there's been broad cross-party consensus on the need to act for climate change. It's seen a number of governments come and go and not repeal that act. So yeah, a lot of our best practices do draw from that Climate Change Act, and it's something that, of course, tailored to the Canadian context, could be a great model here.
Anna, sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Just emphasizing that it's survived a number of conservative governments, which I think in this continent we find astounding. And can you speak to the legal obligations in the Netherlands and how that could possibly force a national consensus on climate here?
Yeah, so I haven't looked at the Netherlands example, but a number of the case studies that we looked at do legislate these long-term emissions reduction targets into law, as well as the governance structures that support them. So one of the potential outcomes of legislating these targets into law is that citizen groups could technically sue the government if they're not upholding their commitment to those climate change targets. It hasn't been done yet within the context of climate accountability frameworks, and there's some uncertainty as to whether those challenges would be successful, but there is the threat of judicial review, and the biggest kind of threat is reputational consequences.
Anna,
those are my daughters suing the government for climate action, so I find it very interesting.
And a couple of weeks ago, we had Marla Ornstein and Patrick Smith from the Canada West Foundation on. And they talked about a study they had done about how difficult it is to permanently lower GHG emissions in Canada and in other countries, and the severity of the measures that need to be taken to meet our targets. Would a accountability framework serve to focus governments, focus Canadians on the task at hand, and get us really serious about reducing our emissions?
I think so. I think it's hard for Canadians and even governments to conceptualize what, for example, net zero by 2050 looks like. And having those 5-year interim emissions reduction milestones, again, supported by expert advice and a whole governance structure around it, really bring those into focus and can help chart a path to that 2050 goal. And it can help provide certainty and clarity to businesses, investors, voters, other levels of government. And really kind of drive those difficult conversations about the level of policy that's necessary to meet these, very ambitious goals.
Dave Juice, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Sure. Just I live in Manitoba, and we, like BC, Quebec, Norway, all our electricity comes from hydro. And so it's relatively easy for us to decarbonize. We have decarbonized our electrical production. But I'm wondering if more work needs to be done in, say, cities like Saskatoon, Edmonton, as sort of the driving points, because they're far more realistic than lower mainland BC, where you can grow palm trees. And I think there'd be a lot more buy-in from a lot more people if the work was being done in a more normal Canadian climate zone sort of thing. Just comment.
Anna, do you want to take that? Or I guess the point that Dave is making is that a lot of Canada is cold. And this is one of the things that drives our high per capita GHG emissions. And how relevant then is the Vancouver example? Because it's kind of an outlier, I guess, from his point of view.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, tying the Vancouver buildings bylaw to climate accountability frameworks as well, it's recognizing that there's no one size fits all policy, and giving governments flexibility to work within those frameworks to find the policies that suit their unique contexts and that are tailored to the challenges and opportunities that they face is really important.
So Anna, is an accountability framework being discussed at the federal level and with the provincial governments? And are we making progress? And if we are, where are we at with that?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that we undertook this analysis is that back in the fall, the federal government, as part of the Environment and Climate Change Canada ministerial mandate letter, they committed to setting this net zero target by 2050. And as part of that, setting these 5-year legally binding interim emissions reduction milestones based on expert advice and consultation with Canadians. And so we wanted to understand kind of what that could mean and what other jurisdictions are doing along those lines. And what we found is that those interim emission reduction milestones are great, but when supported by a broader climate accountability framework, they have much more chance of being successful in helping governments reach those targets. So in terms of discussions at the federal level, that's as far as we've gotten, I believe, but both Manitoba and BC already have that legislation in place, which is a really great start for the country.
Anna, thank you very much for this, and we'll be checking in with you in the future to see what kind of progress, if any, that we're making. And thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.